The first time they crossed my fence, I just stood there on the porch and watched them like they were some kind of strange migratory bird that had lost their way. But by the third time, when they brought a drone to buzz my cattle and a clipboard to tell me my barn was an eyesore, I knew I wasn't an oppos. Dealing with neighbors anymore. I was dealing with a virus. My name is Silas Vance, and I've spent 62 years on this patch of red dirt in the hill country outside of Austin, a place my great-grandfather bought with gold coins and handshake back when the only HOA out here was the law of the Winchester. This land, 240 acres of cedar, limestone, and stubbornness, is held in a family trust so old the paper feels like dried skin, and it's the only thing in this world I truly own, which is why I didn't in oppos. Take it kindly when the Silver Oaks Reserve sprouted up on my northern border like a patch of poison ivy. They called it an executive sanctuary, But to me, it looked like a cluster of beige shoeboxes jammed together by people who wanted to live in the country without actually touching any of the dirt. I didn't in oppos. Mind them at first. I figured they'd stay on their side of the white vinyl, and I'd stay on mine with my barbed wire and my Black Angus. But then came the welcome committee, I remember that morning the air was still heavy with the smell of damp earth and diesel, and I was greasing the tractor when a silver SUV idled up to my gate. Out stepped a woman named Regina, wearing a silk scarf in 80-degree heat, and a man named Marcus who looked like he'd never had a callus on his hands in his entire life. They didn't in oppos. Asked to come in. They just stood there at the gate like they were inspecting a zoo exhibit, and Regina held up this glossy packet, telling me they were the board members for the Silver Oaks HOA, and that they were concerned, about the visual harmony of the area. I just leaned against the fence post, wiped the grease off my hand with a rag, and looked at them until the silence got uncomfortable, because out here, silence is a tool, and most city folks don in oppos. Know how to use it. Finally, I told them, Mon oppos. I'm not in your club. I don in oppos. Pay your dues and mind oppos. Harmony in oppos. Comes from the sound of rain on a tin roof, not a neighborhood charter. Her smile didn't in oppos. Even flicker, it was like it was painted on her face by a professional, and she started talking about, livestock visibility, and how my old hay barn was dragging down the property values of their $3 million villas. Marcus chimed in with a voice that sounded like a dry cough, mentioning that, agricultural runoff, was a safety concern for their community pool, and that maybe it was time for me to consider, modernizing, or moving on. I just told them to get off my dirt before the cows got offended, and I watched them drive away, thinking that was the end of a silly misunderstanding, but I was wrong. I was so damn wrong, because people like Regina Dawn and oppos. A neighbor, they see an obstacle. A week later, the drone started. It was a low, annoying hum that sounded like a giant mosquito hovering right over my calving pen at 6 in the morning, and it wasn't oppos. Just passing through, it was filming, spying on my life like I was some kind of criminal. I didn't in oppos. Reached for my shotgun right away, though Eleanor, that in oppos, that's my granddad's old 12-gauge, was leaning right there by the door. Instead, I started a logbook. I'm a man of records, and I knew that in a world of lawyers, a man's word is only as good as the timestamps he keeps. So I wrote down every flight, every trespass, and every time concerned resident, stopped their car on my fence to point and whisper. Then the letters started arriving, official-looking envelopes with no stamps, hand-delivered to my mailbox, claiming I was violating county ordinances I'd never heard of, accusing me of animal cruelty because my cows were, too thin, and demanding I repaint my barn neutral earth tone, to match their aesthetic. I tossed the letters in the wood stove, but the rot was spreading, and soon enough, I had a county inspector knocking on my door, a young kid who looked embarrassed to be there, saying someone had reported a, deadly chemical leak, near my creek. We walked down to the water, which was clear as gin and full of perch, and he just sighed, shook his head, and told me, Mr. Vance, someone really has it out for you. I got to file a report, but there's nothing here, That's when I realized this wasn't oppos. Just a nuisance. It was a siege, and they weren't oppos. Going to stop until they buried me in so much paperwork I'd have to sell, just to pay the legal fees. I felt a heat in my chest that hadn't and oppos. T been there in years, a cold, focused kind of anger that makes you think clearly instead of shouting. And I decided if they wanted to play games with my land, I was going to teach them how we play for keeps in the brush. I went out and bought 6 high-end trail cameras, the kind that send photos straight to your phone and work in total darkness. And I didn't in oppos. T put them on the gate where they'd be seen. I hid them in birdhouses, hollowed-out logs, and deep inside the cedar thickets along the fence line. I also reached out to an old friend, a retired sheriff named Miller, who knew where all the bodies were buried in this county, figuratively speaking, of course. And he told me that Regina wasn't into oppos. T just some bored housewife. Her husband owned the development company that built Silver Oaks, and they still had 50 lots left to sell that were sitting empty because nobody wanted to buy a luxury villa next to a, stinky farm, It was a money move, plain and simple, and once I knew the motive, the whole picture became clear as a bell. One night, around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed on a nightstand, and I saw a grainy black and white image of 2 men in hoodies cutting the lock on my northern gate. I didn't into oppos. T called the police right away. I just grabbed Eleanor and a heavy-duty flashlight and walked out into the pasture, staying low in the shadows of the oaks, and I heard the metallic clatter of the gate swinging open. They were trying to drive my herd out onto the county road in the middle of the night, hoping some poor soul would hit a 1,200-pound steer so they could sue me into oblivion for public endangerment. I watched them waving their arms, trying to spook the lead cow, but my girls are used to me, and they just stood there looking confused until I stepped out of the darkness and racked a shell into the chamber. The sound of a pump-action shotgun in the middle of a quiet night is a universal language, and those 2 boys froze like they'd been struck by lightning, dropping their bolt cutters right there in the dirt. I didn't in oppos. T shoot. I didn't in oppos. T even yell. I just held the light on them and said, "You've got 10 seconds to get back across that line before I decide you're coyotes." They scrambled, tripping over their own feet to get back to their SUV, but I had their faces on camera, and I had the bolt cutters with their prints on them. Most men would have gone to the sheriff the next morning, but Miller had warned me that Regina had friends on the county board. So I waited, I kept my mouth shut, and I started digging. Literally. I borrowed a backhoe from a cousin and spent 3 days digging these massive, jagged trenches right along the fence line where the Silver Oaks nature trail was supposed to go, making it look like I was prepping for some kind of massive industrial drainage project or maybe a hog rendering pit. The HOA went into a frenzy. They sent Regina back over with a lawyer this time, a man in a pinstripe suit who started barking about, environmental impact studies, and nuisance construction, I just leaned on the backhoe, lit a cigar, and handed them a folder containing a valid 30-year-old permit for a, waste management lagoon, that my father had filed back in the 70s and never used. I told them, if I can in oppos, tee my barn the way I like it, I figure I'll just build a slurry pond right here. The wind usually blows north, so you folks should get a real good whiff of it by mid-July. Regina's face turned a shade of purple I didn't into oppos. Tino existed in nature, and her lawyers started stuttering about injunctions, but I just smiled because for the first time, they were the ones who were scared. But the real kicker came a week later when a man named Julian showed up at my door. He was a younger guy who'd just bought a house in Silver Oaks, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He handed me a thumb drive and told me he'd been at a board meeting where he'd overheard Regina and Marcus talking about permanent solution, to the Vance problem. On that drive was a recorded Zoom call where Regina was explicitly detailing a plan to hire a contractor to dump medical waste into my upstream creek bed, something that would not only kill my livestock but would force the state to condemn my land. She was laughing about it, saying, once he's gone, we can subdivide that acreage and triple our margins, I felt a chill go down my spine, not because I was scared of her, but because of the sheer casual evil of it, the way some people think money gives them the right to erase a man's history. I didn't in oppos, to go to the local papers, and I didn't in oppos, to go to the county sheriff. Miller put me in touch with a state investigator and a high-powered land use attorney out of Dallas who had a reputation for eating HOAs for breakfast. We spent a month building the war chest, We had the drone footage, the bolt cutter incident, the fake letters, the recorded conspiracy, and the testimonies from 3 other local farmers who had been bullied by Regina's husband's company in the past. When we finally filed the lawsuit, we didn't oppose. T just asked for an injunction. We sued for racketeering, conspiracy, and attempted environmental sabotage, and we named every board member personally. The day of the hearing was the first time I'd worn a tie since my wife's funeral, and I sat there in that wood-paneled courtroom, feeling out of place but steady as a rock, watching Regina sit at the defense table looking like she'd just swallowed a lemon. Her lawyers try to play it off as in, quote, community concern, in quote, and in, quote, neighborly disputes, in quote, but then my attorney played the Zoom recording. The silence that followed her voice talking about dumping waste into my creek was so heavy you could have felt it in your bones, and even the judge, a man who'd seen everything, looked at her with a disgust that was plain as day. By the time we got to the evidence of the gate cutting and the fingerprints on the bolt cutters, the defense was basically in shambles. They were turning on each other like rats in a flooded cellar. The fallout was spectacular, the kind of thing they'll be talking about in the general store for the next 20 years. Regina's husband's company was hit with a state investigation that uncovered years of forged permits and kickbacks to county officials, and the HOA was essentially bankrupt by the time the legal fees and the settlements were tallied up. Regina herself ended up with a felony conviction for conspiracy and had to sell her in, quote, sanctuary, in quote, just to stay out of a longer prison sentence and the Silver Oaks Reserve. Well, it's still there, but the end, quote, welcome committee, in quote, is gone, and the new board sent me a very polite, very terrified letter promising to never look at my fence line again. I'm back to my routine now. The trenches are filled in, and the cattle are grazing near the north fence again, blissfully unaware of how close they came to being part of a, quote, waste management lagoon, end quote. People ask me sometimes if I'm happy I won, if I feel like justice was served, and I usually just tell them that I'm glad the quiet is back, because that's all I ever wanted in the first place. But there's a part of me that looks at those empty beige houses next door and feels a bit of a sting, because it's shooting into oppos. T have to be a war just to live on your own land, and it's shooting into oppos. T take a shotgun and a lawyer to remind people that a fence ISN and oppos. T just a suggestion. It's a border. Some folks say I was too hard on them, that I should have been more, in quote, neighborly, in quote, from the start, but I found that some people mistake kindness for weakness, and if you give them an inch of your dirt, they'll try to take the whole acre and call it, in quote, progress, in quote. My granddad used to say that land is the only thing that doesn't in oppos. T lie to you. It gives back exactly what you put in, and I guess I put in enough fight to keep it for one more generation. It makes you wonder, though, how many other people are out there right now, sitting on porches they've owned for 50 years, watching a silver SUV roll up to their gate with a glossy packet and a plan to redraw their world. If you're one of them, my advice is simple. Keep your logbook tight, your cameras hidden, and never, ever let them see you flinch because bullies like that don in oppos. T have roots, they only have greed, and greed can in oppos. T stand up to a man who knows exactly where he stands. Now, I've got a fence to mend on the south side and a tractor that needs a new belt, so I'll leave you with this. When is a neighbor not a neighbor? And at what point do you stop being, in quote, polite, in quote, and start being, in quote, protected, in quote? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Tell me about the lines you've had to draw in your own life. And if you think I went too far, or if I did exactly what needed to be done to save my soul. If you found this story worth your time, hit that like button and share it around. Because the more people know how to fight back, the fewer Reginas we'll have in this world. Stay safe, keep your powder dry, and remember, your land is your history. Don and oppos. T let anyone turn it into their profit.